The most powerful version of Roman Reigns did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived with silence, control, and something WWE had avoided for years. What happens when the chosen one is never chosen? What happens when the crown is never placed on Roman Reigns' head? He was built to lead an empire, but the tribal chief was a risk WWE hesitated to take. What if that power was never unlocked? What if the dominance fans feared never arrived? Because without that turn, the entire balance of WWE shifts. Legacies change. Stars rise too early. So let's start and step into the version of Roman Reigns the company never unleashed. The years of forced power. Before the tribal chief, Roman Reigns was positioned as dominance without permission. He was pushed as the future, whether the audience accepted it or not. Wins were constant. Presentation was loud, but belief was missing. The more WWE insisted, the more resistance hardened. Roman wasn't failing because he lacked ability. He was failing because the character had no leverage. He had power, but not control. And in wrestling, control is everything. Without the tribal chief turn, that imbalance never corrects itself. Roman continues to win, but never fully rules. The audience continues to watch, but never fully submit. That tension doesn't explode, it decays. The tribal chief was not a creative gamble. It was a necessity disguised as courage. WWE needed Roman to stop asking for approval and start enforcing order. The heel turn didn't make him darker, it made him honest. It aligned his dominance with intention. Without it, Roman remains trapped in a role where strength feels imposed instead of earned. That is the most dangerous position a top star can occupy, because every victory feels hollow and every loss feels corrective rather than meaningful. What the locker room loses. The tribal chief era didn't just elevate Roman, it reintroduced hierarchy. Suddenly, there was a center again, a gravitational force other characters could orbit without being diminished. Without that version of Roman, WWE lacks a true apex presence. Champions rotate, feuds blur together, authority feels temporary. Wrestlers fight for spotlight instead of survival. That weakens the ecosystem. Wrestling thrives when there is something to resist, not just something to chase. The bloodline never exists. Remove the tribal chief and the bloodline collapses before it's born. No long-term dominance, no internal tension built on loyalty and fear, no slow-burning betrayal that feels inevitable rather than shocking. WWE loses one of its rare modern stories that trusted patience over spectacle. Without it, storytelling reverts to short-term fixes. Moments happen, but legacies don't form. More than ratings, more than merchandise, WWE stood to lose credibility. The tribal chief era told the audience that WWE could still evolve, that it could listen without surrendering authority, that it could let a star grow into power instead of forcing power onto him. Without that evolution, the company remains stuck in a loop of manufacturing heroes instead of revealing them. That eventually exhausts both performers and fans. Greatness versus comfort. Pushing Roman as a tribal chief meant accepting that the audience had been right all along, that resistance wasn't rebellion, it was instinct. Ignoring that would have been safer in the short term, but safety had already failed. Greatness required letting Roman become something uncomfortable, slower, colder, and more deliberate. Without that choice, WWE keeps moving, but without direction. A company without a center of gravity. If Roman Reigns never becomes a tribal chief, WWE enters a dangerous phase where nothing feels permanent. Champions rise and fall, but none feel inevitable. Stories begin, but they don't settle into the audience's bones. Without a central figure enforcing order, everything feels negotiable. Faces can be rejected, heels can be ignored. The company keeps moving, but it moves sideways. Wrestling needs a gravity point, someone whose presence defines the stakes of every room he enters. Without the tribal chief, that gravity never fully returns. In this version of history, Roman Reigns remains caught between intention and perception. He keeps winning, but the wins feel like assignments rather than statements. He keeps being presented as the guy, but the audience never feels the consequences of that declaration. Over time, Roman stops being the future and starts becoming a reminder of creative stubbornness. Not because he failed, but because the system refused to let him change. That kind of stagnation slowly drains even the strongest performers. What happens to fear? The Tribal Chief era brought fear back into WWE. Not shock, not chaos, fear. The quiet understanding that if you crossed Roman, something would be taken from you. Time, momentum, identity. Without that, rivalries lose edge. Challengers feel brave instead of desperate. When fear disappears, danger follows, because nothing feels truly risky anymore. Wrestling becomes louder, faster, and emptier all at once. One of the most important things the Tribal Chief represented was an admission. WWE admitting that the audience had been telling the truth for years. That Roman didn't need to be louder, he needed to be colder. Without this shift, WWE never learns that lesson. It continues trying to correct reactions instead of understanding them. That mistake doesn't just affect Roman, it affects everyone who follows. Future stars learn that resistance is something to fight, not something to study. Chaos disguised as freedom. Without the Tribal Chief, WWE sells freedom instead of structure. More people get opportunities, more faces rotate through the main event. On the surface, it looks healthy, but underneath, the absence of a true ruler creates chaos that no one is accountable for. When no one feels permanent, nothing feels dangerous. Wrestlers challenge champions without fear. Victories feel interchangeable. Losses feel temporary. The audience senses that safety net immediately, and once they do, tension drains from every major moment. The Bloodline was not just a faction, it was a long-term pressure system. Loyalty meant survival, disobedience meant erasure. Without the Tribal Chief, that dynamic never exists. WWE loses one of the few modern stories that treated power as something earned, enforced, and defended over time. Instead of slow betrayal and internal collapse, storytelling reverts to short arcs and sudden turns. Surprises replace inevitability. Shock replaces weight. The difference matters more than people realize. Roman without evolution becomes a warning. In this reality, Roman Reigns does not become the standard. He becomes the cautionary tale, a performer with every tool who was never allowed to recalibrate. His presence remains strong, but never defining. Over time, fans stop arguing about him because arguments require belief. Indifference is worse. A top star fading into accepted background noise is one of the most damaging outcomes a company can create, and it happens quietly, without headlines. Audiences learn that dominance is temporary and authority is artificial, that no one truly rules because the system won't allow it. That realization changes how fans watch everything else. They invest less emotionally. They wait for resets. They stop expecting consequences. Wrestling still entertains, but it stops commanding attention. That shift doesn't show up in one night. It shows up over years. The Tribal Chief was proof that WWE could still create something that felt final, something that didn't ask permission, something that made the audience lean forward instead of scrolling past. Without that proof, the company survives on momentum rather than conviction. It keeps moving, but it stops planting flags that define eras. When Roman Reigns is never allowed to become the Tribal Chief, the main event loses its sense of finality. Matches can still be good, some can even be great, but they stop feeling consequential. The audience never believes that crossing the top champion will change a career permanently. Defeat no longer feels like exile. Victory no longer feels like escape. Everything resets too easily, and when resets become predictable, danger disappears. Wrestling without danger becomes performance, not power. Without a single dominant center, authority spreads thin. Multiple figures are presented as important, but none feel essential. This creates constant motion, but no direction. Wrestlers fight for positioning rather than survival. Feuds overlap instead of escalating. Championships rotate instead of ruling. The audience watches movement but rarely feels momentum building towards something unavoidable. The tribal chief era worked because it forced everyone else to react to one force. Remove that, and reactions lose urgency. The psychological loss WWE never quantified. What WWE gained from the tribal chief was not just ratings or buzz, it gained psychological leverage. Fans believed in consequences again. They believed that alignment mattered, that loyalty had a price, that defiance carried risk. Without that belief, the audience becomes emotionally conservative. They stop committing fully because history has taught them commitment won't be rewarded. That kind of loss is invisible on spreadsheets, but devastating long-term. In this version of history, Roman Reigns is remembered as strong but unfinished, successful but unresolved, a constant presence who never reached inevitability. Not because he lacked talent, but because the system never allowed him to stop asking for acceptance and start demanding obedience. Legends are not defined by how long they stay on top. They are defined by how clearly they reshape the world around them. Without the tribal chief, Roman reshapes very little. Even hypothetically removing the tribal chief reveals how necessary it was. The fact that modern WWE feels thinner, louder, and less anchored without him exposes the truth. This was not just a good storyline, it was structural reinforcement. It reminded wrestling how to build fear slowly, how to let silence speak, how to make dominance feel earned rather than assigned. Without it, the era survives, but it never settles into history with weight, an era that never fully lands. Without the tribal chief, modern WWE keeps producing moments but struggles to produce memory. Big matches happen, returns get reactions, titles change hands, yet very little settles into permanence. The audience watches, reacts, and moves on. Nothing feels carved into history. The reason is simple. There is no figure powerful enough to anchor the chaos. Eras need a ruler, not to dominate screen time, but to give everything else meaning in contrast. Without Roman's tribal chief, WWE keeps sprinting forward without ever planting its flag. The tribal chief didn't succeed because people loved him. He succeeded because people feared losing to him. Fear creates stakes that popularity never can. When a champion is feared, challengers feel desperate. When challengers feel desperate, stories gain gravity. Remove that fear and you remove urgency. Wrestlers chase titles because that's what they're supposed to do, not because failure will cost them something irreversible. Wrestling becomes competitive, but not existential. And existential tension is what keeps audiences emotionally invested long-term. Without the tribal chief enforcing hierarchy, WWE becomes a place where losses are educational instead of damaging. Characters lose and reappear unchanged. Momentum resets quietly. Authority figures explain instead of punish. This teaches the audience that nothing truly matters beyond the next segment. The tribal chief era reintroduced consequence as storytelling currency. Take it away, and WWE reverts to motion without memory. Things happen, but they don't scar. Roman's career in this timeline. In this version of history, Roman Reigns remains visible but never unavoidable. He is strong, respected, and present, yet never mythic. His career becomes long instead of legendary. He's remembered for consistency rather than command. That is not failure, but it is limitation. Wrestling legends are not just performers who succeed. They are forces that reorganize the ecosystem around them. Without the tribal chief, Roman never becomes that force. He becomes proof of how far someone can go without ever fully being unleashed. The tribal chief taught WWE that audiences will accept dominance if it feels honest, that slow pacing can feel heavier than constant action, that silence can carry more authority than noise. Without learning those lessons, WWE continues chasing balance instead of conviction. It keeps trying to please instead of command. Over time, that weakens its voice. The company still exists, it still thrives financially, but creatively, it speaks softer than it needs to. Becoming the tribal chief required WWE to admit past mistakes, to accept that forcing a hero had failed, to let a star evolve into something colder, slower, and more threatening. That discomfort produced greatness. Without it, WWE avoids the pain but also avoids the reward. Greatness always costs something: control, certainty, ego. WWE paid that price once. Without the tribal chief, it never does. The quiet truth at the center. If Roman Reigns is never the tribal chief, WWE does not collapse. It survives. But survival is not the same as authority. The company keeps moving, but it stops commanding the room. The tribal chief did not just rule storylines, he restored belief in consequence. Take that away, and modern wrestling becomes faster, louder, and easier to forget. And the most dangerous thing a dominant company can become is forgettable. The ending that changes everything. If Roman Reigns is never the tribal chief, modern WWE has no true ruler. Only placeholders, only noise. The era becomes louder but thinner. More motion, less weight. The tribal chief didn't just redefine Roman, he reminded wrestling what real authority feels like. Take that away, and the system survives, but it never truly commands again.